So what you see is the exalted form of the human. And this exalted form of the human is reflected within society. And when you have the exalted form of the human society, you have what so many people call utopia. It's nothing more than a conscious humanity, where the delusion of separateness does no longer exist.
Is this something where we all live on the same planet together, physically, but consciously in a different place?
Yes. And the reason that I say that is because the people who are talking about this concept of the new earth not being something that takes place physically on earth are in resistance to physicality. Source itself is not in resistance to physicality. There is so much ecstasy to be experienced in the physical life, and it's just going to get better. The same as like if I was to take you right now and put you back in the 1600s and to see what the medical practices are back then, you're like, it's barbaric. So to them in that age, this seems like a dream. And I'm like sort of trying to explain that sort of the pain that we have with our physical experience doesn't really exist in this new earth experience. Because like even if you were to get out of alignment, we're looking at progress in the future, and that's not even all the way to the new earth, like progress in the future where you get sick and literally you pass through a light that's able to reset everything. There's no pain involved in this process. It's, today I manifested cancer cells. I passed through this light. Now they're gone, and stuff that most of us cannot conceptualize of from this place that we're in today.
It makes me think of some stories that I've heard from other people about extraterrestrials and things that have come to Earth that they were supposed to build and then it didn't get to happen and things like that. And so then it makes me wonder about the role, I'm guessing extraterrestrials exist, other entities.
Yes.
Right. I figured that was the case. I didn't want to assume. So what is their role then? What is their role in our evolution?
It depends on the one. Yeah. So let's go. I'll give an overview, but I mean, it's important for people who are watching this to know that we're greatly simplifying concepts for the sake of, people being able to understand things. So yeah, this is like in and of itself, its own a rabbit hole, but
I might take you a little ways down the rabbit hole. Okay.
All right. So when it comes to extraterrestrials, it's really like across the map what level of consciousness these beings have and what role they're playing within the greater universe. You have what we call a malevolent being. Universally speaking, is not necessarily a malevolent being, and this is what's hard for people to grasp. And the way that I kind of spell this is, I could have an argument about this, but I'm gonna just throw this out. It's not a perfect example, but you've probably heard people saying it's really important for us to weed a certain population of species out here. Otherwise, the Earth's going to get in trouble. Do you think that we are the villain to that species or the victor, even though we see ourselves this way? That we're the villain, right? We're the bad guy. We're the one that's coming in and saying, I
feel like we're wrecking a lot of things.
We are, but like we see ourselves oftentimes as doing something beneficial, whereas that's not what is being perceived by whatever species is doing their thing.
Oh.
So the first story that I'm going to essentially tell you about is the story where there's extraterrestrial beings who are considered like universal scavengers or part of the universal immune system.
Okay.
Now, if you have a species that is behaving like a bacterial infection, then it gets targeted by the immune system of the universe at large, which just so happens to be, that we could consider like a T cell within source to be one of these extraterrestrial beings. So they essentially target a species that's so acting in its own best interest against the rest of the system that it comes in and essentially tries to take it out. At the same time as you have an extraterrestrial being who's like, you know what, there's so much value in humanity, we can make humanity choose. So even they are playing into this choice point where you've got, these extraterrestrial beings who are trying to prove that the human race is essentially gone rogue and is a cleanup species, meaning it's one we have to take out of the picture of the rest of the system. Because to be honest with you right now, the amount of collective asking from Earth, from other species, plant kingdom, mineral kingdom, animal kingdom, that are asking for us to go is huge. It's like a signal throughout the universe, right?
Not good.
At the same time as you're having like a whole like other, form of extraterrestrial beings, and this is more complicated, which have reached this level of awareness in general, where they understand that there is nothing in the universe that is not it. And so when there's this distress call being made by things around a being that you also are, there's an inherent desire to bring that aspect back into alignment because you don't see it as separate to oneself. So there's essentially a war, this bigger war being waged over humanity, but it's not a traditional war. It's the war over what will they choose if there's influence. So you've got these extraterrestrial beings trying to influence humanity to like prove that they are a garbage species essentially that's causing problems in the greater universe and world. And this whole group, which is trying to put influence on humans to prove that they're capable of being like, wait, I'm not going to act like a cancer cell. I'm going to tune back into the system and essentially create a win-win, which they're so capable of doing.
So how do these fighter T cells, or whatever we want to call them, how do they get us to try and essentially be wiped out?
Manipulating the media. But what's important to know is they're not controlling people. They're putting pressure on people. These extraterrestrial beings, it doesn't matter what ET you talk to, right? All of them understand the concept of free will and choice. All of them have to operate within this, the primary laws that govern our universe, like law of attraction, which is why, there's no such thing as like a what we call a gray. There's no such thing as a gray alien as from Zeta Reticuli. There's no such thing as them coming in and doing an abduction on somebody who hasn't already experienced some form of powerlessness at the hands of an abuser or whatever. It doesn't happen. So they're operating within, the rules within this greater universe. They can't not. They understand choice. So it's like they are not able to control you, neither. They're able to influence. So they're going to influence through, anything that makes humanity go towards the ego, things like fear, things like, greed, things like envy, all of these experiences that can catch people and cause them to, separate. At the same time as you've got the other ones who are essentially like, no, love, no, tune into people, no, And we're kind of seeing where humanity
goes. Feel
yourself,
feel your emotions.
Yeah.
Like, I don't have time. I got this other thing going on. My ego's calling. The ego game, that is a clawing game. And in fact, it makes me think of certain times where I feel like I've had egoic deaths along the way. There's a 1 or 2 rounds of like a last chance clawing. And it really seems like that, where these weird like talons come out and you say and do things that you're like, what the hell was that? Like, I've made so much progress. That was terrible. And it feels like there's like this vicious coming for you. And is that a phase that we're in where we just need to like endure this sort of vicious phase that's happening, where this division and this sort of choice game is really challenging?
We have to embrace the fact that there is this massive challenge of the pressure cooker of this awakening that I'm describing. But what we must do is to aggressively love the ego.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's what nobody's doing. And it's a struggle for me, even because, English language again, when I'm here telling you that the ego is doing something super bad, the natural reflection for a human is to be like, all right, then we got to push the ego away.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's how it wins right there. And it's not even about a winning losing game. The ego is incredibly beneficial, but unless we really spend time to understand it and figure out how to meet its needs, and by doing so, come in as a kind of like, I'm caretaking the ego as a tool of my own, rather than it's this thing that runs me, we're not going to be able to make this transition happen.
How do we do that? How do we make friends with the ego? How do we love the ego? How do we understand the ego?
You understand the value of having self. You understand the value of the aspects of self. And by virtue of understanding the value, you know what place to put it in, I think the recognition of the ego is the first step. Most people, it's a very complicated practice. It's like, you can look at Buddhist monks, for example. You've got people who have taken themselves out of society, put themselves in a monastery, and they're practicing this for 80 years straight. So it's even more difficult when you're in the world and you've got so many triggers for the ego. But the recognition of the ego, which is this perception of separate self, is the first step to recognize when any aspect of you is fighting for self in any way. And to not make that wrong. It's just the recognition, And that's what we call that external witnessing, or some people call this detachment or disidentification.
Mm-hmm.
Be able to say, interesting, I am watching Teal, if I'm doing me, I am watching Teal have a reaction to the fact that this person has achieved something I have not achieved. what does that tell me about myself? And it's like, you're almost approaching it like you would. I don't want to like belittle the ego by saying it's like a child, but there's a very loving way you can approach a child when it's in that state. How do I empower the self so it's not in the state where it's grasping? How do I sit with my emotions to allow myself to understand that the way that it feels makes sense? And all of this process causes a calming down of an integration of the ego. And so what we end up with eventually is the conscious ego, which most people don't understand as a state that exists. Most people think consciousness is when you get rid of the ego. Right. I think that's the worst thing that we've ever taught, honestly.